you doing? I want to talk to you today about inequality. There we go. What's inequality? As a country, the second official sentence we ever uttered had that word equality. We said we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal. Now, that just can't be right. You can look around, you could see some of us are smarter than others. Some of us are more attractive than others. Some of us are stronger than others. Some of us are more talented. And yet, what we're describing here isn't inequality, it's diversity. We're all different. Inequality, in the sense that the founders meant it, was one person ruling over another without the other's consent. This is what the founders meant by inequality. Now, what inequality today brings to mind when we say it is not the Baratheons, it's the Malfoys and the Weasleys, the haves and the have-nots. But this idea of inequality of the haves and the have-nots hides an important distinction. There's actually two brands of inequality here floating around. One is inequality of outcome. The other is inequality of opportunity. And these two brands of inequality meld together with diversity in a weird way. For example, because some of us are stronger than others, some of us are more talented than others, some of us are more attractive than others, if we have equality of opportunity, then naturally some of us are going to rise higher than others, and we're going to end up with inequality of outcome. However, if we take this diversity and we hold back those who are more in the ways that they are more, and push forward those who are less in the ways that they are less, we impose an inequality of opportunity. And by doing that, we can achieve equality of outcome. What this means is, because of diversity, we don't have the luxury to say that we are for equality. If you claim, my slides have disappeared. Oh, there they are. If you claim that you are for equality of opportunity, then by definition you are also for inequality of outcome, because that's what happens when you combine equality of opportunity with a diverse population. Conversely, if you claim that you are for equality of outcome, then by definition you are also for inequality of opportunity. Because you might say in response, well, if all of this is happening because of diversity, let's just eliminate it. Make everybody the same. And the problem here is, diversity has given us all the things we have, precisely because you have strengths that I don't, and I have strengths that you don't. We have the ability to come together in society, in community, and each of us can offer the thing that we're good at in exchange for the thing that we aren't. And what results is all kinds of wondrousness that we wouldn't have otherwise. This is the fruits of our diversity. So, because of the diversity, we face a choice. You're going to have to choose which brand of inequality you are for, because you are for one of those brands of inequality. I want to make for you today a case for the inequality of outcome, and consequently a case for the equality of opportunity. My case for inequality of outcome goes like this. First off, outcome equality actually favors poverty, and it has to do with the mathematics. If you have a distribution of incomes like this, incomes, or wealth if you prefer to think of it like that, are bounded at zero. You can't go below zero. But on the top end, the sky's the limit. So if I have a distribution of households like this, from the poor to the middle class to the rich, and I take those households that are poor and I make them rich, inequality arises. I've made my society more unequal in terms of outcome. Conversely, if I take those households that are rich and I make them poor, inequality falls. So in an odd way, it's easier to achieve outcome equality by making people poor than it is by making people rich. And if you want examples of that, I present you with planet Earth. You can look through our history, you could look at various cultures throughout time, you could look at several of them right now, and what you will see is in almost every case, when a society has decided we're going to actively work toward equality of outcome, what they achieved was poverty. Second argument, outcome equality focuses on the wrong thing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about profit, and I want to make a distinction at the start between voluntary and involuntary profit. Involuntary profit is a problem, voluntary profit is not. So let's talk about the voluntary profit. And we've got this guy who has money and the other guy who has a car, and they're going to come together and they're going to exchange. So the guy with the money gives it to the guy on the right, and the guy with the car gives the car to the guy on the left, and they both walk away better off than when they arrived. How do I know they're better off? Because the transaction was voluntary. If they weren't better off, they wouldn't engage in this transaction. Now, occasionally do people make stupid decisions and you buy things that you shouldn't have bought? You know, if you have ever been to a prom, you probably understand this. Yeah, we make errors in our purchases, but we learn from those errors, and on average, in general, we tend to correct them, so over time, we don't. What you find is, generally speaking, over time, on average, voluntary transactions like this leave both people better off. So here's this example. Let's multiply it. We have several other people who come along, and they want to buy cars as well. And now, if I look at this society and I ask questions about outcome inequality, what we tend to do is focus on the dollars. And we see there's one guy standing here with all the dollars, and we say, this is unequitable. What we've missed is the dispersion of the goods. It's the goods that matter. That's why the dollars are there in the first place. They're to facilitate the movement of goods and services amongst people. If I really care about outcome inequality, what I should be looking at is what do people have? What are their goods and services? You experience this all the time. This guy dies with $8 billion in the bank. If you want to put that in perspective, in the time I will be speaking here, that much money will generate enough interest income to send one of you to college for 4 years. $8 billion. Raise your hand if you have $1 billion in the bank. Yeah, I think I'd need about 500,000 of you to expect to get one hand. Nobody's got $1 billion in the bank. Raise your hand if you got a smartphone. Aha! Now look around the room and you see all the hands up. Where did this guy get his $8 billion? We gave it to him because we liked his smartphones better than we liked the dollars in our pockets. We handed him our dollars, he hands us our smartphones, and what do you have? If you look at the dispersion of dollars, you see them concentrated in this guy's hands. But the dollars don't matter. It's the goods and services that matter. If you look at the smartphones, you find them dispersed amongst the population. Now, go back to the car example. So we've got this guy buying the car from the guy on the right, and repeat the thought experiment, but this time, have each car buyer buy from a different person. And now, if you look at this society and ask, tell me about inequality here, we'll look over here and we say, well, there's a dispersion of dollars. There's lots of equality here. But look, it's the same dispersion of goods that we had before. There's no difference here. In one case, we say this is an example of inequality. In that case, we say it's an example of equality. But in both cases, the people are equally well off. Everybody's got a car here, everybody's got a car there. The dispersion of the goods and services is what matters. Third argument for equality of opportunity. Outcome equality demonizes something that's really good. So you've got this guy, and he does stuff for his neighbors. He paints houses, or he fixes cars, he mows lawns, whatever it is. And he asks for things in return. He asks for some food, some clothing, some shelter. Now, suppose it's the case that for whatever reason, maybe there aren't many people who can do these things, or maybe there are lots of people who need them done, or maybe he's particularly good at doing them, whatever it is. For some reason, society highly values this stuff that this guy does. And suppose it's also the case, for some reason, maybe society has lots of food, clothing, and shelter laying around, maybe it's easy to produce, whatever it is, but for whatever reason, society does not place a high value on the goods and services he asks for in exchange. If I describe a society like this, most people would look at this red guy and say, that's exactly the kind of guy I want as my next door neighbor. I wish all people were like this. They contribute more value to society than they ask for in return. But now superimpose on top of this a monetary system. So this guy offers his services, and the community pays him lots of dollars. Why do they pay him lots of dollars? Because they highly value the thing he's producing. In exchange, he buys food, clothing, and shelter. And the community does not ask for many dollars in return. Why? Because the community does not value these things nearly as much. And so if you run time forward, what you find is that this guy is going to accumulate a pile of dollars. That pile of dollars is not a signal that he has to give back to society. It's a signal that he has already given to society more than he asked for in return. The dollars are IOUs of society saying, we owe you a bunch of stuff you haven't consumed yet. Take these dollars, and when you want the stuff, just hand them over. All right. I've given you 3 arguments for outcome inequality. Let's ask some serious questions about how bad it is. This is the Gini coefficient, and if you study anything about what people say about inequality, they quote this number. In fact, you may have seen this graph in the past. That goes back from 1967 up to the present. You can see the measure for inequality rising. So people point at this. They share it on Facebook and say, this is what's wrong with capitalism. It's just never-ending inequality. Well, part of the problem with this picture is the Gini coefficient, this is our measure of inequality, ranges on a scale of 0 to 1. You could see that this scale is 35 to 49. If I blow the thing up the way it should look, you see that. Not nearly the massive increase that you were led to believe, but it's still rising over time. Okay, tell me this. Do you care about this kind of outcome inequality, or do you care more about that kind of outcome inequality? That is, do we care that there are poor people, there's kind of rich people, and there's ungodly rich people? Or do we care that there are haves and have-nots? Because the Gini coefficient measures that first kind. With the Gini coefficient, it's possible that you could have an increase in inequality amongst the kind of rich and the ungodly rich, and you would see your measure of inequality go up, despite the fact that really there's been no change between the haves and the have-nots. The way to get at this idea of the haves versus the have-nots is to lump all the rich together. Now I'm going to show you some data from the Census Bureau. This is people's incomes, and they're divided up exactly as the Census Bureau divides them up. And yes, everything's adjusted for inflation. Over on the left, this is the poor. And then in the middle is the middle class, and over there is the rich. So as you move to the right, it's more and more income. The height of the bar is the number of households that fall into this income category. So for example, here's 1970. In 1970, in the United States, 54% of American households fell into these middle 3 categories. That was our solid middle class that you hear about. In 1970, 35% of American households fell into the poor category, and in that same year, 12% of American households fell into the rich category. This is the United States in 1970. Now, run time forward. And what do you see? There are exceptions, but there's this overall trend. Here, the middle class is disappearing. This thing you keep hearing about the middle class disappearing, it is. You're looking at it right here. In 1970, 54% of households in the United States were in the middle class. By 2017, it had fallen to 41%. Now, when people say the middle class is disappearing, the unspoken conclusion is, well, they're becoming poor. Except that's not the case. Look at what happened to the fraction of households in the poor categories. Didn't fall as much, but it fell, and it was remarkable. Went from 35% to 30%. Where did all these households go? They went over there. The fraction of American households that were rich in 1970 was just above 10%. Today it's almost 30%. Yeah, the middle class is disappearing. So is the poor class. They're becoming rich. So this kind of outcome inequality is rising. This is what the Gini coefficient measures. But largely, this kind of income inequality is not what we care about. We care about that kind, the haves versus the have-nots, and that's actually falling. So when you see this statement about year after year inequality in the United States is increasing, it's not because there's a widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. It's because there's a widening gap between the rich, the kind of rich, the ultra-rich, and then the ungodly rich. But if you put them all into one category, because if you're rich, that's all I care about. If you put them all in one category, you find the differences between the rich and the poor are actually declining. They're not rising. How do we know? Well, today's poor live better than yesterday's middle class. In 100 years ago, the average, this is an actual picture of a middle-class worker. You can see he's typing on, I don't know what that thing is. In the background, you can see a candlestick phone. This is an actual office worker from actually 100 years ago. Made 20 cents an hour after adjusting for taxes. Today, the average middle-class worker makes $18.64 an hour, adjusting for taxes. The average minimum wage worker makes $6.14, adjusting for, I'm sorry, not the average minimum wage worker. This would be a full-time worker at $7.25 an hour, right? So $7.25 an hour, making $6.14. Oh, and that's excluding benefits, right? This guy back here 100 years ago pretty much got no benefits at all. This guy in the middle gets benefits that are probably equal about 40% of his wages. And the person on the right, a lot of minimum wage workers, not all of them, but a lot of them do receive some benefits of some sort, even if it's just unemployment compensation. Okay, now, you could look at that and you could say, yes, but things were much cheaper 100 years ago. Quite right. So what I'm going to do now is show you how long the average worker had to work to earn enough money to buy various things. Let's start with the guy 100 years ago. So the average worker 100 years ago had to work, what is that, like 20 minutes to earn enough money to buy a loaf of bread. He had to work an hour and 45 minutes to earn enough money to buy a pound of butter. Same for a dozen eggs. This is how much it cost the average worker 100 years ago. How much time he had to work to earn enough money to buy those various things. Now, look at the average worker today. It's incredibly low. The average worker today works for what, like 8 minutes to afford enough money to buy a pound of butter versus 45 minutes for the average worker 100 years ago. What's really astounding is if you look at the minimum wage worker today. The minimum wage worker today actually has a higher standard of living than the middle class worker did 100 years ago. Oh, with the exception of movies over there. Movies are a lot more expensive. But the reason movies are more expensive is because stuff like this has tremendous amounts of special effects in them that's very expensive to produce. This is a clip from an actual movie from 100 years ago. Not only does it not have special effects, it doesn't even have effects. This was a silent film. And it wasn't like retro silent film. That's like state of the art. That's what they had, silent films. So yeah, it costs more to go to a movie, but look what you're getting instead. Here's cars 100 years ago. The average office worker 100 years ago had to work almost 10,000 hours to afford a car. The minimum wage worker today only has to work 5,000 hours to afford a car. And what do you get for your 5,000 hours? You get the guy on the right versus the guy on the left. The guy on the right, anti-lock brakes. The guy on the left, brakes, maybe. The guy on the right, air conditioning. The guy on the left, you got no choice. It's just the windows, right? Whatever comes in. Median house. The median house costs the median house causes, there are too many M's in this sentence. The minimum, good Lord. The median house costs the average middle-class worker today less than it cost the average middle-class worker 100 years ago. The average minimum wage worker has to pay more, but look what you're getting. Difference between the kind of a house, apartment today versus apartment 100 years ago. 100 years ago, the average apartment or the average house might have had running water, maybe. If you did have running water, you didn't have running hot water. It was just running cold. No electricity. Forget about air conditioning. No gas, nothing. It's just like four walls and a roof. It was so Spartan that the minimum wage worker today can't buy one of those because it's illegal. Now, you might say in response, well, these arguments don't matter. Outcome inequality is simply wrong. Okay. When people say this, they typically follow it up with, well, we've got to do something about the 1%. In the United States, the poverty rate for a single person is $13,000. The median household income is $60,000. Do you know how much you have to earn to be in the 1%? What's the crossover number? How much? 100,000? No. 420,000. Put you into the 1%. Now, that's not the average. The average 1%er makes $1.5 million. But to join the ranks of the 1%, you've got to earn $420,000. So here you could look at this and say, well, clearly we've got a problem here because you've got the people at the top earning, like, what is that, 30 times what the people at the poverty line are earning. Okay, but why are we talking about the United States? Why would you draw an arbitrary line on a map and only talk about the people inside that line? If we care about the poor, if we care about inequality, let's talk about people. So here's planet Earth. This is all the people we know of at the moment. On planet Earth, the poverty rate is $2,000. Oh, and this is, everything I'm going to show you is adjusted for differences in costs of living across countries. So yes, it's cheaper to live in Mexico than it is in the United States. That's been taken into account when you see these numbers. This comes from the World Bank. This is their official definition of extreme poverty, $2,000 for the year. Middle class. To be a middle class worker on planet Earth, you have to have a household income of $10,000. Do you know how much you have to earn to be a 1%er? Not bad. 60,000. Where'd my little pictures go? He didn't show up. $60,000 is what you have to earn to be in the 1% on planet Earth. So if you think about American households on the planet, 98% of us are above the poverty line. 90% of us are at least middle class. 60% of us are 1%. We make all this noise about the 1%. We are a nation composed almost entirely of 1%ers. When we start complaining about how much money Bill Gates has, the rest of the world shakes its head and thinks, what the hell are you talking about? It would be like us hearing Elon Musk compare himself to Warren Buffett and to say that he's somehow disadvantaged. Shut up. Now, you can come back with the ever-present counter-argument. These are all lies. Everyone knows that people are worse off today. Okay. This is world population going back to 10,000 BC. This is Thomas Malthus writing in 1798. And in 1798, Thomas Malthus looked at the graph that you see here, and he said, WTF. Look at what's happening to the number of people on the planet. He's seeing this hockey stick of population growth. And at the same time he's seeing this, he looks out the window and he sees at his time 95% of the world was living in extreme poverty. And so he writes about this, and he says basically, look, we are living Armageddon right now. In 1-2 generations, there's going to be nothing left, because most people are extremely poor as it is, and look at what we're doing to the number of people. Well, it turns out Thomas Malthus was wrong. He was wrong on a couple of counts. One count that he was wrong is that he was too optimistic. He projected what the population would look like 100 years down the road. He was woefully undercounting. This is what the world population looked like when your grandparents were born. This is what it looked like when your parents were born. This is what it looked like when you were born. And this is what it looks like today. And you see little tiny Thomas Malthus down there complaining about the number of people. Look what actually happened. And remember, at the time that Thomas Malthus is writing, 95% of the world is living in poverty. What happened to world poverty over this period? Here's Thomas Malthus, 95% of the world lives in poverty. By the time your grandparents were born, the number had fallen to about 65%. By the time your parents were born, the number of humans living in extreme poverty had dropped below 45%. By the time you were born, it had dropped below 30%. And now, for the first time in the history of Homo sapiens, the number of human beings living in extreme poverty is less than 10%. Thomas Malthus was wrong on 2 counts. 1, the population grew much faster than he thought it would. And 2, things got better, not worse. And you could say, yeah, well, you're just talking about poverty. Society is clearly worse off in other ways. You just turn on the news and you see this. Yeah, not so much. Over the past 1 or 2 generations, the rate of firearm deaths in the United States, down 50%. Do we still have shootings like we had in Pittsburgh half a year ago? Yeah. Are they incredibly sad and concerning? Yeah. Are they numerous? No. The reason you see them on the news is because they're rare. What do you not see on the news? Generally speaking, somebody killed in a traffic accident. Now, if it's a big, massive car pileup, you'll see that. But some single person killed in a traffic accident, you might hear something about it. It's not going to be a big thing in the news. People aren't going to have talking heads discussing traffic accidents. Why? Not because it isn't sad, not because it doesn't deserve our attention, but because it's so common. The reason you see shootings is precisely because they're uncommon. Rate of non-fatal firearm crimes is down 75%. The rate of deaths due to war is down 95%. Child labor rates worldwide down 50%. Global gender inequality, this is measured by the United Nations, not known for right-wing propaganda, down 15%. Global longevity in education up 20%. Global income, this comes from the World Bank, up 40%. The world is becoming a massively wonderful place to live in. Maybe, but maybe really all of this comes at a cost. And the cost is, yes, on average, things are looking better, but there's this outcome inequality going on. Some of us are getting better, some of us are getting worse. Okay? Here's the distribution of income in 1800. So you're seeing across the horizontal, this is income. So going to the right, that's better, that's more income. And the up and down, that's the number of people. That is the extreme poverty line. And you can see in 1800, this was Thomas Malthus's observation of, oh my God, look at the number of people living in extreme poverty. So we can divide them into groups. You get the poor, the middle class, and the rich, and I put everybody in quotes because they're all poor by our standards. Right? But you had the really stinking poor, you had the run-of-the-mill poor, and then you had the, well, not always poor, but kind of poor. the poor, the middle class, the rich. That's the world in 1800. Now, run time forward. And I'll stop here at 1980 and notice a couple of things. First off, inequality has gotten way worse. You've got exactly the story that you often hear. Well, yes, things are better on average, but they're only better on average. The fact is, we got a bunch of people who are doing really well and a bunch of people who are doing really poorly. That's what the world did look like in 1980. Move time forward. There's the world today. And what happened? What happened was, as the Industrial Revolution and then following on that, the Technical Revolution took hold, it took hold not everywhere simultaneously. It took hold in some countries first. And those countries moved out. They became richer. And what do you get? You got inequality. Why? Because inequality is what naturally happens when some people get rich. But that's not the end of the story. All of that wondrousness didn't stay confined to those countries. They started trading with other countries. And those countries started to adopt technologies and new processes. And in fact, they got to adopt technologies and processes that were beyond what these people got to adopt because these people were the first movers. It's like the guy who gets the first digital watch. He's all proud of himself. Look, I got my digital watch. He paid $300 for it. And then my kid gets one for free for opening a checking account that shows the time and the weather and will order an Uber for you and all this nonsense, right? The second mover actually gets to move faster than the first mover does. And what happened? The red is largely China and India. They were second movers. But when they started moving, look where they end up. Do we still have poor amongst us? Absolutely we do. But they're getting less and less every day as everyone moves in this direction. So, I would leave you with this conclusion. We talk about diversity. Some people are stronger than others. Some people are more talented than others. Some people are luckier than others. And because of that, we face a choice. And the choice is you can have equality in outcome or you can have equality in opportunity, but by definition, you cannot have both. You're going to have to choose an inequality and embrace it. So the question is, what do you want? Do you want inequality of outcome or do you want inequality of opportunity? And my argument here is that of the two, inequality of outcome is the one you want. And why is that the case? Well, it's the case because, first off, inequality of outcome, the easy way to achieve it is to make everybody poor. Making people rich actually gives you inequality of outcome. The whole idea of equality of outcome tends to look at the wrong thing. We are fixated on where the dollars are going, completely ignoring where the goods and services are going. It's the goods and services that matter. It tends to demonize profit, as if the guy who earns a profit has taken something from society, when in fact the guy who makes a profit has contributed more to society than he has asked for. The dollars are IOUs he hasn't cashed in. If you lump all of the rich together, what you find is inequality is actually falling. The delta between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots, is actually declining steadily over time. And all of this, despite the fact that we have a tremendously larger number of people on the planet, poverty worldwide, not just in the United States, has fallen tremendously. We're tending to become, on a global scale, not just within the United States, much more equal. And then finally, when we talk about the 1%, our tendency is to look up to those who have more. And there's not many of them. What we do when we look up to those who have more is we ignore the oceans of humanity who have less. Do we have poor amongst us? Absolutely. Do we have a responsibility to take care of them? Absolutely we do. More than a legal responsibility, in fact, I'd argue it's not a legal responsibility at all. More than that, it's a moral responsibility. Each one of us has an obligation to take care of those who are less than we are. But the way to begin doing that is to let go of this fixation with outcome inequality. Because when all the dust settles, you all are the 1%. If you really want the 1% to start doing something, reach into your pocket. That's where the 1%'s money is. If you like this kind of thing, I will give a shameless plug to my podcast, Words and Numbers. We come out every Wednesday. We have over 100 episodes, and we talk. Me and my co-host, James Harrigan. He's a political scientist. We talk about stuff like this. Things that are important to you, to current events, seen through the eyes of an economist and a political scientist. Half-hour episodes. You can do it while you're jogging on your treadmill, whatever it is you do. We have a few minutes if you have any questions. Yes, sir. You're going to have to yell. Oh, look, we got a microphone.
So, to me, it seems like equality in general is a socialist principle. And what I mean by that is equal outcome doesn't work, as you said, because the state shouldn't really enforce people to end up the same. Similarly, equal opportunity doesn't work because the state shouldn't enforce everyone to start out the same. So aren't you really just arguing for the removal of state interference, or do you really believe in equal opportunity? And if so, how would you impose that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. No, I'm not arguing for the removal of state interference. The government has a good and proper role to play. And that good and proper role is as a referee, making sure that I, in my strength, cannot take from you in your weakness, or vice versa. But other than preventing me from imposing harm on you, or you from imposing harm on your neighbor, other than doing that, the government should leave us alone. And there you get the maximization of opportunity. You have laid out in front of you all of the opportunities that you were born with, that comprise your family, your community, your circumstances. They're all there, and the government is going to prevent anyone from stopping you from using them. But as to using them, that's up to you.
Right over here, I got one. With regards to equality of opportunity, what do we say when we see widespread inequality in outcome along specific lines that are not merit-based, such as race? For example, when we see that median income among black households is nearly $30,000 a year lower than median white households, is it fair to conclude that this suggests some degree of inequality of opportunity along those lines?
Yeah, so I would say two things here. And the first is a caution, and the second is the recipe. And the caution is, be careful when you see stuff like that. And I don't know the numbers well enough for race, but I do know them for gender. That we look and we see women earn 80 cents on the dollar for what every man earns. And we look at that, we say, well, this is an unjust inequality. And our knee-jerk reaction is to say, well, it must be due to gender because that's how we divided them, by gender. And we see the difference. And there have been many papers written on this. If you drill down into it, and you probably know this story, what you find is the difference almost entirely is due to life choices. That you have a woman who has children, takes time out of her work history, raises the children, goes back, and of course she's going to go back at a lower salary than somebody who's been continuing to work. Women, for whatever reason, on average, tend to work part-time more so than men do. And yet when you see the numbers, 80 cents on the dollar, they're not adjusted for that fact. Women tend to, and we see this in the colleges and universities, not in every case, of course, but on average, they tend to be predominantly represented in majors that have to do with healthcare, not healthcare, dealing with people, so like child and family studies, psychology, things like that. In the disciplines that tend to be more STEM-oriented, you tend to find more men on average than women. And of course, there are salary differences there. Now, I'm not going to let the gender issue go for that because there could still be some gender bias. My argument here is if you drill down into the numbers, what you find is that if there is gender bias, it isn't at the hiring level. It may be at the education level, where we encourage women to go into these fields versus those fields. It could be At the parenting level, where parents push their female children to do one thing and their male children to do something else, I'm not saying it is, but I'm saying if there is gender bias, that's where we should be looking, because the numbers clearly show that it isn't in the hiring. So that's my warning. Now, in terms of the recipe of what do you do about this? The first thing I would ask is, before asking the question, what can we do to fix this? I would ask the question, what are we doing to perpetuate it? For example, talk about minorities versus majorities racially. It tends to be the case that income levels are lower amongst minority groups. I won't say whether this has anything to do with race or not. What I do want to focus is the income. People at low income levels have more difficulty accessing things like accountants, things like good legal representation. They're less likely to have parents who have friends who are well-placed judges or CEOs or entrepreneurs. And why does that matter? Well, why that matters is because if I'm a kid growing up in a household that has higher income, all of those connections, all of this stuff, I have access to these various things, and I want to start a business, it's way easier for me than it is for the kid that comes up in a household in which the parents don't have those connections and they can't afford all of the legal stuff and the accountants and all of that to start the business. And so consequently, it's much harder for me to do this, right? Why is it harder? I would argue in part, and in large part, the difference in the ease in starting these two businesses and then consequently earning the incomes that comes thereafter. The difference is due to the fact that we have imposed so much regulation. And by regulation, I mean specifically unnecessary stuff. Things like, if you want to become a hairdresser in some states, I think Louisiana was recently in the news, you need something like 1,000 hours or 1,500 hours of training to be a hairdresser. And why is that the case? Well, if you look into it, you're told that, well, this is about safety. We want to make sure that people who get their hair cut are safe because there's going to be scissors near your eyes and your ears and stuff like that, right? 1,000 hours. Do you know how many hours it takes to become a lawyer and a medical doctor? It's less than the number of hours it takes to become a hairdresser. What's going on? What's really going on is that some people over here who had access to the resources to start their own business, to become hairdressers, became wealthy enough that they could influence the regulators and say to them, you know what, this hairdressing thing, this is really important. We shouldn't be allowing just anybody to do it. Let's impose these rules for the sake of public safety. And everybody says, yes, this is a good idea. Well, what are the rules really doing? They're preventing people from competing with these guys. So go back to the example I gave you of voluntary versus involuntary profit. And I said involuntary profit's a problem. This is an example of involuntary profit. I'm making my money not because I'm offering a good to you and you like it and you pay it. Partly it's that. But largely I'm making my money because I had the ability to co-opt the government to prevent some group of people from coming in and competing with me. And that's a big problem. I think not in every case, but in a large chunk of the cases when you see racial inequality, you will find that that has a lot to do with it. It's not everything, but it's a lot of it, and it's the one that the economists would look at and say, cut that out.
Everybody, let's give a round of applause to Antony Davies. Thank you. Can't get that clicker from you. Thank you so much, sir.